All right, let's go. 12 o'clock. This is Beyond the MCSE Red Teaming Active Directory, and I'm Sean Metcalf. Otherwise, you're in the wrong room. But since it's single track today, I think you're in the right room. I'm the founder of Trimark, a security company, a Microsoft certified master in Active Directory, one of about 100 in the world, and a Microsoft MVP. I've spoken at Black Hat last year and this year, and DEF CON last year and this year, and I'm very excited to talk to you about some AD security stuff. I'm a security consultant and researcher, and I own and operate adsecurity.org, which hopefully you're all aware of. So we're going to talk about some key AD components from a security perspective, things I think that security professionals should know about. Some offensive PowerShell stuff, basically how you can bypass some of the new PowerShell version 5 security features. Effective AD recon, and then some of the defenses you'll run into as a red teamer and how to bypass them. And then we'll wrap up with a checklist. So for the red teamers in the room, this is what hacking looks like, right? Get full access. Score! Love hackers, right? Or maybe you've done this. Of course, you've rappelled from the top of the warehouse over the server, and you have extracted the information, right? And of course, everyone has done the Tom Cruise move when hacking a system. You're hanging over the computer and typing stuff in. Close to it, right? It looks more like this, like PowerShell Empire, Mimikatz. Oh, so close. But there's differing views of Active Directory. The administrator, the security professional, and the attacker have different perspectives of what Active Directory looks like. None of them have the complete picture of what it is. The Active Directory administrator and engineer, their perspective of Active Directory is through their tools. AD users, computers, domains and trusts, group policy, sites and services, some PowerShell. And the security professional's view of Active Directory is through their SIM tool, the vulnerability scanner, the events, the event log. The attacker's perspective is much different. They're getting a lot of information about what's going on in the environment. When you red team an Active Directory, you do recon, grab some credentials, go from there, grab some credentials, and then DA, pop the champagne, right? Okay, that's interesting. Oh, thanks, Lee. So note to future speakers, when you send your slides to someone and they send them back to you, make sure you check them before you get up in front of DEF CON. So, thank you, Lee Holmes. All right, let's get started. Okay. Let's talk about Active Directory security. I'll try to recover from that. So an Active Directory forest is like the UFP from Star Trek. You've got the United Federation of Planets, you've got a lot of starships, they're all one part of one happy family, right? And in this analogy, every starship is a domain joined to the UFP forest. And the executive officers on the ship are the domain admins for their ship, or domain. And if a ship's executive officer, domain admin, is compromised, then so is the ship. In the instance of the USS Reliant, Khan was able to compromise one of the executive officers and own that ship and all the systems on it. And then, since two ships come together, they're all part of one happy federation and one forest, they're all implicitly trusted, which can lead to some really interesting scenarios, like where one officer on one ship can control critical systems on another, like shields. So Khan was a bit dismayed that admins in one domain could control domain resources in another and effectively become a domain admin on that other domain. So if you're a blue team member, don't be like Khan. If you're a red team member, it's awesome because that means that in a multi-domain forest environment, you compromise one domain, you compromise the entire forest. So let's talk about domain controllers for a minute. We know that you take a member server, you run DC promo, it promos up to a domain controller, right? There's a template ntds.dit Active Directory database file on every member server that is used to see that initial database. And that domain controller that's being promoted will pull the domain data from other domain controllers in that domain to then fill that Active Directory database with the domain information, such as usernames, passwords. Computers have passwords, there are passwords in there also. Trusts have passwords, it's in there also. And so the users connect to these domain controllers for authentication and directory services, as do applications. So these are the critical servers in Active Directory. They host the global catalog. The global catalog can be thought of as a partition that goes across and crosses all the domains in the Active Directory forest. where it has information about every object in the Active Directory forest, but a subset of the attributes. This means if you're doing some recon and you want to know about all the users in the whole AD forest, you just connect to the GC port on the domain controller and query that, instead of connecting to every single domain controller. So if DNS is used on a domain controller and the domain controller hosts it, oftentimes when you have AD integrated DNS, this means that the DNS information is stored in Active Directory and replicated through Active Directory. So then we have read-only domain controllers, which is this really weird animal that Microsoft came up with in 2008. So it's read-only DC services, read-only DNS, read-only sysvol. This means that when you run into a read-only domain controller in an environment, it cannot replicate or send modifications to Active Directory to domain controllers. It's not allowed to. And it has its own KRBTGT account, which means that Kerberos is cryptographically isolated from the rest of the domain. And the read-only domain controller does not have any passwords on it relating to that domain by default. You have to actually add them to a group so that their passwords can be cached there. So when a user logs on to a site that has a read-only domain controller, their password isn't on that read-only. So the read-only sends their authentication request to a writable, and then the writable services that authentication request, at which point the read-only says, well, give me the password for this user. And the writable will check to see if that's allowed or disallowed based on group membership, and then either send the password down to the read-only or not. This means that there's certain passwords that will be on read-onlys. Read-onlys are not trusted at the same level as regular domain controllers. So what this means is that if you find an administrator of a read-only domain controller, which you can find by looking at the managed of attribute for that read-only, you can compromise that, and then you can compromise the passwords of the accounts that are stored on the read-only. There's two really interesting attributes with read-onlys. Authenticated to account list. These are all of the accounts that have authenticated to the read-only domain controller. It doesn't mean their passwords on it. That's the revealed list. So if you run into an environment with read-only domain controllers, enumerate the membership or the values that are in the revealed list attribute for the read-onlys. And then you'll know all the passwords that are on there. Technically, the environment and the administrators are supposed to add admins to the denied RODC replication group, but they don't often do that. And admin accounts can end up on read-onlys. So how do clients discover domain controllers? Well, DNS, we run DNS query, we get the SRV records for domain controllers. Or we can use ADSI if we have PowerShell, which is highly recommended. But how do clients do this? Well, we have network subnets in the real world, right? That's how stuff talks to each other. Well, you take those network subnets and you put them in Active Directory and associate them with sites. And this maps AD to the physical world. This enables a client in one location to communicate with the domain controller in that same location, or at least nearby, as well as resources like DFS shares. The interesting thing is that if a client asks the domain controller what site I'm in, and the domain controller can't map that client's IP address to a subnet, DC goes, I have no idea. Try again. That client goes, hey, domain controller, what site am I in? Says, I don't know, try again. And it happens several times, and finally the client gives up and just picks a domain controller. So this is interesting because that means logs may actually be on a totally different domain controller for that activity, for that computer, than what the IR team or what the blue team is looking for, if they haven't configured sites correctly. So group policy is a way to manage user and computer policy and security settings. You create a group policy, you configure the settings on it, you link it to an OU or a domain, and you have the group policy object, which is an AD. The computer boots up, it identifies what OU it's in, what group policies are applied. There's a link in that group policy object to sysvol to say, these are where those files are, those group policy files and settings that need to be applied. So it copies down those files and applies them. The interesting thing here, and it works the same for users, the interesting thing here is if you can insert yourself between that domain controller sysvol share and that client, and get the client to connect to your sysvol share, you can actually have that client run your own version of that group policy. Also, if you can modify the group policy object in Active Directory, or those setting files in sysvol, then you can have that computer apply those policy settings. Well, group policy has a lot of capabilities, so this could be adding local administrators, adding update service, you can add or update services, deploying scheduled tasks, installing software, etc. So let's talk about some of the more fun stuff. PowerShell. Everyone uses PowerShell now, right, as an attack tool. It's awesome. Run code in memory without touching disk. Download and execute code from another system. Interface with .NET and the Windows APIs. There's been nothing like it on the Windows platform before. And about 6 years ago at DEF CON 18, Dave Kennedy and Josh Kelly talked about PowerShell, OMFG. I mean, it was amazing, and they talked about a lot of the great features that PowerShell has for attackers and for red teamers. And guess what? Ransomware, I think the ransomware authors have just viewed that because they're starting to use these techniques. And in 2012, just a couple years later, Matt Graber released PowerSploit, which is effectively the foundational PowerShell attack tool framework that just about all of the PowerShell attack tools leverage, which includes invoke Mimikatz. PowerShell version 5, great for blue teamers. Red teamers, you have to tiptoe a little more carefully once PowerShell version 5 security is enabled. Because what this means is, if they have script block logging enabled, even if you've obfuscated your PowerShell code, before it's executed by the PowerShell engine, whatever that final code is that's been deobfuscated, it gets logged to the event log in 4104. And if they've enabled system-wide transcript files, this is really interesting, because they'll have set up a write once share on the network where everything you type into PowerShell on the computer that has version 5 with this enabled, that transcript file will be sent, streamed effectively to that network share. So it's per computer, per user, which means they'll have an over-the-shoulder transcript of everything that was typed, including any typos, which is always interesting. Constrained language mode is a version of PowerShell, or a language mode for PowerShell, which locks PowerShell down to the base elements. So no .NET, no API calls. Invoke Mimikatz will not work in constrained language mode. If an environment has PowerShell version 5, an app locker and allow mode, PowerShell locks down in constrained language mode automatically. And in Windows 10, it gets even more interesting because Windows 10 introduces the AMSI, the anti-malware scan interface, where any PowerShell code or VB script code, before it's executed by the PowerShell engine, it's kicked over to the AMSI, which sends it over to the anti-malware solution. And the anti-malware solution will give a thumbs up or a thumbs down. If it's a thumbs down, PowerShell will not execute that code, be it downloaded from the internet and run in memory or run from a script. Now, there's only a couple of vendors that support AMSI. So red teamers, you're still in good shape. Microsoft supports it, and AVG. I don't know why. We're still waiting on McAfee and Symantec to catch up, I guess. But there's also ways to bypass AMSI. If you're using an executable that's calling PowerShell code, and you drop your custom AMSI.dll file in that same location, you can effectively hijack the AMSI calls and just say, no, 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 this code's okay. Don't worry about it. Or Matt Graber, PowerSploit author, he figured out how to fit into a tweet the PowerShell command that bypasses AMSI. Pretty awesome. Microsoft is working on it. I mean, this is a year later. Not the tweet. The tweet's only like a couple months old. The anniversary update for Windows 10 is out, so maybe that'll fix it. So Lee Christensen released unmanaged PowerShell not that long ago. It's been rolled into Metasploit. And basically this allows you to call a lot of PowerShell commands and run PowerShell code without calling PowerShell.exe, among other things. And one of my favorite PowerShell attack tools, PS Attack, is a single executable which contains some of the popular and best PowerShell attack tools that are out there. It encrypts them into an executable, and there's a build tool so you can custom encrypt your own. And when it runs, it decrypts these files or these PowerShell functions into memory, where you can run them. And guess what? Constrained language mode is no longer a problem, because when you run PowerShell code from an executable, it bypasses the standard mechanism that handles constrained and language mode, because Microsoft wanted to make sure it was compatible for all the applications that may be calling PowerShell. What about PowerShell version 5 logging? It bypasses that also. Why does this happen? Well, in Windows 7, you have PowerShell version 2 as your base level PowerShell version. And then when you install PowerShell level 5 or version 5, it kind of layers on top of that. So PS Attack, through unmanaged PowerShell and some other fun trickery, actually calls the system.management.automation.dll that is PowerShell at that lower level version, which is version 2, which enables it to bypass and make sure that all of that information, the script code and the results are not logged. Now, smarter organizations will remove PowerShell version 2 from Windows 10, which you can uncheck the box. And when that happens, this log just flows with data when you run PS attack. So let's talk about some fun, effective Active Directory recon. Ideally, getting more information about the environment than the AD admins. So I'm going to talk a lot about PowerView, written by my friend Will Harmjoy. So PowerView has a lot of great tools in order to get information about Active Directory, and I'm going to call a bunch of them out, so that way hopefully you can start adding this to your toolkit. At the top of the graphics is the PowerView command. I'm also comparing that with the Active Directory PowerShell module, which is available on the Windows servers and the computers, the workstations, if it's installed and configured. So that way you can do some comparison. But we get information about the Active Directory forest. We can get the name of the forest, the sites that are in the forest, so that we can map out what's in that environment. In fact, a really effective way to get information about an Active Directory environment or enterprise is to pull the site information and the subnet information, and you can effectively map out the entire network just with Active Directory. You can get information about the domains that are stored in that forest, the global catalogs. Microsoft recommends that every domain controller is a global catalog. So this means that with one command, you can get a list of pretty much all the domain controllers in the organization. Application partitions. So this will show you, for example, in the graphic right here, you can see that there's DNS that's integrated in Active Directory because they're in application partitions. The forest mode. Here it says 2008 R2 forest. That tells me what security enhancements are not available to those admins in this Active Directory environment. And then, of course, we see what the schema and the domain naming FSMOs are. We look at the domain information, what forest it's in, all of the domain controllers, any child domains, the domain mode, again, telling us what kind of security is available. The PDC emulator. So if you're a red teamer and you want to know what domain controller to connect to when you do all your activity, you might want to target the PDC emulator. Why is that? It is the busiest domain controller on the network. It is also the best connected by Microsoft recommendations. You could also target one that's all the way, at a branch office somewhere. But the logs on the PDC are going to be super busy. And it's also typically a best practice to co-host all the FSMOs on the same domain controller. So it's going to be extra busy. So we have forest, we have domains, we've talked about Star Trek and how awesome it is. But let's talk about trust for a minute. If an organization has trust to other business units in their environment, they may have actually and accidentally compromised their environment. Because a lot of times they create another domain or another forest because of trust issues, right? They're like, I don't really trust that business unit. R&D, they kind of do their own thing. They're kind of cowboys and cowgirls. We'll let them do their thing. But then they create a trust and say we trust everyone in that domain, and then they'll do a two-way trust. And Will Harmjoy has covered a lot of good information about exploiting across trust. So when you dig for gold in Active Directory, you're looking for default and weak passwords, right? I found passwords stored in user attributes. So check the description fields for accounts. Check for the extension attributes, those custom attributes. Sensitive data can be stored in Active Directory because the administrator doesn't realize that all of these attributes, or at least most of them, are available for authenticated users to read. There is an attribute called a confidential attribute, which by default only domain admins can view. That's where sensitive stuff should be stored. That's where BitLocker keys are stored by default. That's where the lapsed passwords are stored by default. Deleted objects. So when an Active Directory admin deletes an object in Active Directory, is it gone? No. Let me hear no. There you go. Exactly, you know, right? It's not deleted. It's marked is deleted. It's hidden, but the data's still there. And so sometimes admins will create an account for, I don't know, a CEO and put some information in there, like a home phone number, like, oh, I shouldn't have done that, delete. Guess what? It's still an Active Directory. You can search for objects that have the is deleted flag and pull that and look at it, and you might find some very interesting information. So I'm going to refer to Will Harmjoy on most of the user and admin hunting activities because he covers it far better than I do and he has a lot of sessions on it. But effectively, using Invoke User Hunter as part of PowerView to go through and identify user home directory servers and shares, profile pass servers and shares, logon script pass, run get net session against each of them, and get information about where they're logged on. And then you can start mapping out who is where and what rights they have. But even better than that, go to the Varus Group session on Saturday at 1 o'clock on Bloodhound, which they announced at B-Sides Las Vegas just a couple days ago. Bloodhound enables you to use PowerView to query and get information, get information about the Active Directory environment, put it into a graph database, and graph out all of the connection points between users and groups and computers. And very quickly and easily identify that this user can go to this group, can have admin access to this computer, has admin access to this computer, where this domain admin's logged onto, and now I have domain admin access. So the initial gathering information takes a little while, but that graphing is very quick. So I highly recommend you check that out. It's called Bloodhound. So there's some interesting user properties on the user objects. Last logon date, password last set. Admin count is a really interesting one, because if admin count is set to 1, it's very likely that user account is a member of domain admins or another privileged group, because there's a process that actually runs every 60 minutes to protect privileged groups in Active Directory, and it stamps them with admin count equals 1. It doesn't go back later on and remove it, so you could have some false positives here, but it can provide some really interesting information. SID history is another interesting one. SID history attribute can contain a SID from another user and provide the same level of access as that user. It's effectively permission cloning. So if you find user accounts with SID history, and that SID history is for another user that has some really interesting capabilities and rights, you could probably clone that or use that account. Custom attributes contain some interesting information. A lot of times organizations code or categorize users using custom attributes. And if there's data in the service principal name, that means that this user account is a service account, is a Kerberos service account. Same thing for computer objects. Let me just call out that these attribute names are specific to the Active Directory PowerShell module commandlets, so they may not translate exactly. Last logon date. So this is effectively when that computer is last rebooted. So what you can do is you get a list of all the computers, find out when they've last rebooted, look at password last set to see if they're still active on the network. If a computer hasn't updated their password last set attribute in, say, 60 days, because by default all the Windows computers should update in around 30, then if they haven't updated in that time, that computer may not be on the network. But if they have updated within that time frame, and the last logon date is 6 months or 8 months, that system hasn't been patched in a long time. So that may be something that you want to look more closely at. And Windows computers by default register their operating system and related information in Active Directory. But so does Linux, so does Mac. So do some storage devices like NetApp and EMC. So you can find information about what's in Active Directory just by asking Active Directory for it. Service principal name, you can get the information about the Kerberos enterprise services on these computers. And then the last two are related to Kerberos delegation. And I spoke about how to leverage Kerberos unconstrained delegation to compromise a domain last year at Black Hat. Did you know that you can do DNS lookups via LDAP? It's pretty cool, right? I don't have to ask DNS where it's probably logged and there's some information about what people are querying for. I can just look at Active Directory. Say, okay, give me a list of these computers, all the domain controllers, and all their IP addresses. And it's an LDAP call. Sure, here you go. Or I can do reverse lookups. What's this computer related to this IP address? Even if there's not pointer records configured in DNS, because this is all through Active Directory. So in the old days, we had to actually do port scanning to find enterprise services. Nowadays, we can use something that I call spin scanning, which is much more efficient. Because Kerberos services have to have a service principal name associated in Active Directory, registered in Active Directory. So there's a number of spin types like MS-SQL SVC, TermServe, WSMan, FIM service, Exchange MDB. We can search for these. We can ask Active Directory for this information, and it'll give it to us. So we can find all the SQL servers very easily. And the format has the spin type, server name, and SQL often has a port number or an instance at the end. So we can get this information by just asking the Active Directory domain controller, and we can get a list of all the servers, their port number, the service accounts associated with them, and some additional information. We can also request all of the user accounts that have service principal names associated with them, which are service accounts. And we can leverage a tool called Kerberos that takes advantage of how Kerberos works, where we can request a service ticket for a specific service principal name or service principal names. And then the domain controller is going to look up that user account associated with that spin, and it's going to encrypt that using that password hash for that user account, and then send it back to us. And if we've requested RC4 encryption, guess what? That password hash is the NTLM password hash. So we can take that service ticket, encrypt it with RC4, encrypt it with that service account's NTLM password hash, take it offline to our attacker machine, and we can run Kerberos against it, which takes a dictionary list, goes through each of those words, does a one-way hash function, and gets the NTLM password hash, and then attempts to decrypt that service ticket using that. And if it's right, if it can open it, then it's guessed the password for that service account, offline, without any admin access, without ever touching the target or communicating with the target. So the old school way for group enumeration, finding your domain admins, is what? Right, group name domain admins. We have two, Luke Skywalker, ADS administrator. We can also enumerate the membership of the RDC groups, denied RDC password replication group, because enterprises should be configuring this so that way these admins are not storing their passwords on RDCs, especially if they have RDCs in the environment. But remember when I mentioned admin count equals 1 gets stamped for privileged groups and accounts? Well, there's 4 here. KERB-TGT is one of those special groups, so we'll put that to the side. But there were 2 members of domain admins, ADS administrator and Luke Skywalker. When we look for admin count equals 1, we have another one, Kylo Ren. Where did he come from? He's a member of the administrators group in the domain. So by looking for admin count equals 1, we can get a lot of information about potentially privileged accounts. Remember, there could be some false positives without any group enumeration. And then one of my favorite components of PowerView is the ability to identify what Active Directory groups have local administrator rights in the environment. Because when you have a large environment, it's very difficult to manage all these workstations. So what are you going to do? You're going to create a group policy, say that your workstation admins group in Active Directory, it should be a member of local administrators for all my workstations. So we're going to take that group policy, configure it, and apply it to the OU that has all the workstations. Well, PowerView can pull that information out and identify which AD admin groups or AD groups have admin access to which computers. And we can do that by targeting a specific OU. And then we can get a list of what group policies apply. And here, it's the workstation admins group. And then the second command that we run will give us a list of all of the computers in that OU. And then, of course, all we need to do is enumerate the membership of workstation admins, and then we know who to target. So I tried to work in the DEF CON theme this year, Attack of the Machines. So computers with admin rights. Why are people putting computer accounts in admin groups? I don't know. I keep finding it. What does this mean? If you find computer accounts, they have a $sign at the end, in an admin group, all you have to do is compromise that computer account and get system on it. And at that point, that system account has those admin rights in Active Directory. So in this case, they added a regular computer to workstation admins. We can discover regular users with admin rights. So users typically have an email address, especially if you're running Exchange in the organization. Or they have a specific naming format, like first name dot last name. We can look for admin accounts or user accounts in admin groups this way. Now, Exchange admins often will have an email address associated with them, so you have to filter some of those out. But it's a nice way to find regular user accounts that have more rights than they should. We can also look for virtual admins, Hyper-V admins, VMware admins, that are often groups in Active Directory that have full admin access to the virtualization platform. Compromise those accounts, you own the infrastructure. But we can also follow the delegation in Active Directory. What delegation has been configured on the OUs in the domain? These are permissions that have been configured directly on the OUs. And here we can see that someone has delegated to the accounts OU, help desk level 2 and help desk level 3. But they made a mistake. Both of those tiered levels have full rights on all objects. An obvious mistake, except for the fact that ACLs are very difficult to parse through and look at and identify. So this means level 3 has far more rights than they should, because they probably should just have reset password access. So we enumerate that group. We see C3PO is the user account that's a member of that group. So we target his account, we tell him we speak Bocce, and we're in good shape, right? We can also use the PowerSploit tool getGPP password to identify credentials in sysvol. It scans the sysvol share on the domain controller. It identifies XML files that have a cpassword attribute, and that gobbledygook that you see is that encrypted password string, which we can decrypt because Microsoft published the decryption key. Thank you. When an organization has Exchange, we can also get information about who they commonly email. In Outlook, you have your contacts. People should be putting their most commonly emailed people in the contacts fields, in the contacts component. But we can add contacts to Active Directory so they show up in the gal. But there are objects in Active Directory now, which means we can get a list of all the contacts in the organization, which is moderately interesting. Much more interesting to me is actually parsing through that and identifying what domains they associate with and what they email with. And as we can see here, it's Empire, Rebel Alliance, Rebel Fleet, Starkiller, the Alliance, First Order. I think they're playing both sides. It's really interesting. We can also get information about the domain password policies. Again, at the top using PowerView, which also gives us the Kerberos policy. And the bottom using the Active Directory PowerShell module. And this is the default password policy. So if you see that the min password length is 7 in an organization, write it up and say, please don't do that. If you need to do something like that, use fine-grained password policies, which of course we can pull as a domain user. And oftentimes the best way to manage passwords for administrators and service accounts is to create a fine-grained password policy that says that they have to have longer passwords than the rest of the domain. So we can also discover all the group policies in the organization that authenticated users have read access, which is all of them by default. And so we can look at them. We can see, all right, there's a domain PowerShell logging policy, a full auditing policy, prevent local account logon, that's interesting, add server admins to local administrator group, AdWorks, okay. Emmet config, app locker config, and lapse. That's interesting. So we can actually pull the app locker whitelisting policy from Active Directory. Now I cheated, it's in binary format, I just converted it to text and parsed it. But I got enough information here that tells me that they're running app blocker in the default configuration and settings. So now I know where I can drop executables and run them from. These policies should be locked down so authenticated users don't have read access. Emmet configuration. Now I know how they're protecting their files, their executables. Again, I cheated, it's a binary file in sysvol, but I converted it to text. But I can get a good amount of information from there. And there's a lapse policy, but it's not that interesting because it's just going to say how long that password is and how often I change it. More interesting is using PowerView to pull the permissions for who has rights to the lapse password attribute, where that clear text password is stored, which is MS, MCS, ADM, PWB. And with this information, we can identify who has the ability to view the lapse passwords. So we can go after those accounts. Because once we have that, we can then pull from Active Directory a list of all of the local admin accounts on all the computers that those users have view access to. So I wrote my own, which has a very nice list of the groups that actually have lapse delegation and where they apply to. And I'll be working with Will Harmjoy to get this into PowerView, so that way you have some good information as well. Because otherwise you need some crazy command foo to type all that in. So let's talk about Active Directory defenses and bypasses. Organizations say, you shall not pass. Are they right? No. I didn't know Captain Jean-Luc Picard was Gandalf, but whatever. So Florian Roth posted a really great graphic that shows the common exploit paths for Windows. They posted this on Twitter. I'm not going to cover this, but it's there for reference. So you run through the same process you always have when you run into these defenses, when they're actually setting up good quality defenses in the organization. One thing that's been popped around a lot in the past year on Twitter is the concept of honey tokens or honey credentials, which for the instance of this talk are credentials injected into memory, deployed somehow, often using run as net only. But these may or may not be real on the network. So if you drop on a box and you dump credentials and you're like, wow, this looks great, I got all these credentials. Check AD to see if it's a valid account. Check to see if it makes sense. Does it pass the sniff test? Or is it a trap?
It's a trap.
So if they're using the Microsoft Local Admin Password Solution, or LAPS, they're randomizing all of those local administrator passwords on the computer, which is great. In fact, in your red team report at the end, when you own them completely, you should say, yeah, use LAPS or something like that, because I use your local admin accounts to jump from one to one to the other, and I like my job to have some challenge and some mystery in it. So if they have LAPS configured, you can use PowerUp to get local admin rights. Obviously, dumped credentials, look for service accounts, the usual stuff. You can find AD accounts that have local admin rights. You can find AD accounts with LAPS password view rights. Or, a lot of organizations deploy LAPS, but LAPS only controls one password, one account's password, which is usually the default admin account. And a lot of organizations still have a lot of additional local admin accounts, which may be spread across the same systems. So look for those. Network segmentation has become very popular. Admin systems are placed in a separate network segment where you can't easily get to them. But there's always a way. Find the admin accounts. Figure out where they log on. Compromise the patching system, because they may have isolated those admin computers and workstations and servers, but they're still using the same SCCM to patch their workstations, their servers, their domain controllers. Stop patching domain controllers with the same system used to patch everything else. Blue teamers. Or maybe there's no members and domain admins, but everyone forgets about the administrator's account. Domain admins gets their Active Directory rights through being a member of the domain administrators group. Domain administrators has full right to AD. Domain admins have full rights to workstations and servers by default in addition. So look for custom delegation like tier or level or workstation or server admins, because someone has rights somewhere. Microsoft has a great white paper about the privileged admin workstation, which is really the baseline for what should be an admin workstation environment. But organizations cheat, and it's very difficult to get this right. It's difficult to go through the whole list of steps and configure it properly. So if you compromise the install media or the patching system, then you can get admin rights on their local admin's workstations. Or you compromise their communications, which are supposed to be encrypted using IPsec or similar, which may not be. Jump or admin servers are very popular, right? We have this one server, all our admins go to it. They log on to that. But if they're not using an admin workstation, they're using the regular user workstation, all we need to do is drop a keylogger on there. PowerSploit has a great PowerShell-based keylogger. We can get those credentials when they type them into their RDP session. Or if they have two-factor enabled on RDP, two-factor often isn't enabled, or possible to my knowledge, for WMI or WinRM PowerShell remoting, PSexec, or namepipe. And if you compromise that jump server, you own the domain. And if the organization has not separated their admin tiers into tier 0 Active Directory administrators, tier 1 server admins, application admins, and tier 3 workstation admins where they're not supposed to log into each other, and maybe they have one admin server for all of these, oh, that's easy. Compromise a workstation admin and then jump up to domain admin. So Microsoft's goal is to get everyone to put their Active Directory admins, their domain admins, into an admin forest, a red forest. And ultimately, their admin accounts that are at lower tiers into another forest. That way they're protected by from the production forest and all the legacy stuff that's there. Most organizations can't get up to 2012 R2 across all of their servers and computers. Can't get up to Windows 10 on their workstations. You can do that in an admin forest. It's a nice recommendation, and Microsoft has a great write-up on it. So you can point them to that. It'll make it a lot more difficult for the red teams in the future and the attackers to actually get full Active Directory domain admin. Because again, you want your job to be interesting, not easy. So there is a universal bypass for most defenses. Get full access from my first slide. Remember that? No, I'm just kidding. It's service accounts. Service accounts are the universal bypass for most defenses. So even if they put all of their Active Directory admins, their domain admin user accounts into that admin force, usually they're service accounts that have rights. Why? Because they're over-permissioned. They're not protected like admins. They're weak passwords, no two-factor, and limited visibility and understanding. There are service accounts that have been in that organization longer than the people that are administering the server, and they have no idea why those accounts are still there or why they have that access. So some interesting Active Directory facts. All authenticated users have read access to most, if not all, objects and their attributes. All authenticated users have read access to most, if not all, contents of sysvol, which includes group policy and scripts, and other things that AD admins just put in there because they never think anyone will find them, including files with passwords in them. Are you kidding me? Standard users can have elevated rights through the magic of SID history, even if they're not a member of any group at all. They could even modify a user or group without elevated rights through custom OU ACLs, custom permissions. Or if they have access to modify a group policy that's linked to the domain or an OU, could take over that group policy and control the organization. So you're a red teamer, you got domain admin in the organization, pop the champagne, woohoo! We won, right? That was a nice day's work. So we pull the domain admin account hashes. Well, there's a few other things that you want to get. You want to get the curved TGT hashes. We know that. We can create golden tickets with it, right? You also want to grab the domain controller computer account password hashes. Because even if the organization changes the first two, you could actually create a silver ticket using that domain controller computer hash to recompromise the organization and run Mimikatz DC sync to pull all the credentials. And I talked about this at DEF CON last year. Interesting fun fact. NetApp, by default, does not change their computer account passwords in Active Directory unless the admin goes in and schedules it. It's documented on NetApp's site. What does this mean? I pull those device password hashes for NetApps and other storage devices, and I'm sure it's the same on others. And once I have that, I can create silver tickets and have read access to all the files on those shares. And I learned recently from a red teaming friend of mine that NetApps often by default also share out on NFS in a Windows environment. So you want to check to make sure that these other file sharing services are not enabled when they're not needed. DSRM account password hashes are the default administrator account on the domain controller, the RID 500 account. If you pull these and they have a DSRM registry key set to 2, you can actually pass the hash to the domain controller, run Mimikatz, and run DC sync off of it. And I talked about this at DerbyCon last year. So, Security Pros AD checklist. Identify who has AD admin rights in the domain and forest. Identify who has the rights to log on to the domain controllers. This includes account operators, backup operators, print operators, server operators by default. They haven't changed that. A help desk user may have the ability to log on to a domain controller because they put their help desk groups into account operators. Identify the virtual host admins. They may be in Active Directory. They're probably in Active Directory, and they're probably not well protected. Scan the domains, the OUs, the admin SD holder, and group policies for inappropriate group policy permissions. And in your report, say, please protect your Active Directory domain admins. Make sure they only log on to admin workstations, admin servers. Don't make my job easy. And limit the service account rights. Go through all of them and figure out what accounts they need. Go back to that vendor and try to figure out what accounts they need. So a quick PowerView AD recon cheat sheet. These slides will be posting on adsecurity.org in about 15 or 20 minutes automatically. So you'll have all of this, but these are all the commandlets or functions I ran from PowerView, so you can look at them later. So in summary, Active Directory stores the history of the organization. Why is this? Because they've deployed Active Directory. They've updated it. They've modernized it. It's their organization paradigm for support and business has changed, so they've shifted things. They've moved things in. They've created new delegation groups. But guess what? Most of that old stuff is still there hiding. If you find it, you can exploit, and you can help them fix it. If you ask the right questions of Active Directory, you can map the Active Directory environment in the enterprise far better than what the admins know about. You can update their documentation for them, if they pay you for it. But you can quickly recon the environment in hours, if not sooner, depending on the size of the organization. But the business requirements ultimately subvert security every time. So in your reports, make sure that you highlight this and say, look, if you want to fix this, you're going to have to spend some money, fix the resources, do what needs to be done. If you identify the proper leverage and apply it, you will own Active Directory, and you will help the organization fix it. Because as a red teamer, your job is to make the blue team better and help them level up their defenses. So that next time when you get brought in, you run through your playbook and you go, wow, nice job. And you tell them that. They'll love that. Say, hey, great job on fixing these things we talked about later. We checked it. You did a great job. And you'll probably get hired again. So that's my time. Thank you very much for yours. Any questions?